Something unusual happened in Russia this week. On the 25th of August, CIA Director John Ratcliffe made an unannounced trip to the Russian capital for talks with senior Russian intelligence officials. Now, CIA directors don't routinely fly to Moscow. In fact, trips like this have happened only twice in the past decade. And if you look at when those previous visits occurred, this latest trip becomes much more interesting. Because historically, Washington has used this kind of intelligence-level diplomacy when it is deeply concerned about escalation. So the question is not simply why did the CIA director go to Moscow? The more important question is, what is Washington so worried about that could happen next? And perhaps just as important, does this visit suggest that diplomacy of Ukraine is finally moving? Or does it tell us almost exactly the opposite? So let's unpack this. So why does this visit matter? First, the context. CIA Director John Ratcliffe traveled to Moscow on the 25th of August for discussions with Russian intelligence officials. The trip was both rare and unannounced, and there are only two recent precedents for something similar. In November 2021, then CIA Director William Burns traveled to Moscow. That was just a few months before Russia invaded Ukraine. Burns went with a very specific message from Washington. The US knew Russia was preparing for a possible invasion, and Moscow needed to understand the consequences if it went ahead. Now we know what happened next. Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022. The other example came in 2016. Then CIA Director John Brennan traveled to Moscow during a period of serious tension over Syria. Part of his mission was again to communicate warnings directly to Russia, but also to establish a channel through which Washington and Moscow could discuss the political future of Syria. So there is a pattern here. When conventional diplomacy becomes difficult, but the risks of miscalculation become very high, Washington sometimes turns to intelligence channels, and that may be what we are seeing again. So why did Ratcliffe go this time? According to people briefed on the trip, one of Ratcliffe's principal objectives was to deliver a warning. Washington wanted Moscow to understand the consequences of any attack on NATO territory, and the countries apparently causing particular concern are the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. That is significant because all three are NATO members. An attack against one of them could trigger NATO's Article 5 collective defense commitment, and that would transform the conflict. We would no longer simply be talking about a Russia-Ukraine war. We would potentially be talking about a direct confrontation between Russia and NATO. So from Washington's perspective, making sure Moscow understands exactly where the red lines are is enormously important. But that may not have been the only purpose of Ratcliffe's trip. There is the back channel. The second possible objective is quieter, but potentially just as important, keeping a back channel open. There's an important precedent here. In November 2022, then CIA Director William Burns met Sergei Naryshkin, the head of Russia's Foreign Intelligence Service, in Ankara. Publicly, Washington emphasized that Burns wasn't there to negotiate over Ukraine. His purpose was primarily to communicate US concerns and red lines. But that meeting also created something extremely useful, a direct channel between Washington and Moscow. That matters because during a conflict, particularly one involving a nuclear power, governments need ways of communicating that don't necessarily involve formal diplomatic negotiations. A back channel allows both sides to say, this is our red line, this is what we think you're doing, and this is what we will do if you cross that red line. And sometimes, critically, this is what we are not doing. That last point can be just as important. Wars can escalate because one side misunderstands the intentions of the other. A functioning back channel doesn't eliminate that risk, but it can reduce it. And Ratcliffe's Moscow visit may be an attempt to make sure such channel exists if the war enters a more dangerous phase. So, is this the beginning of peace negotiations? Now here's where we need to be careful, because when a CIA director secretly travels from Moscow, it's tempting to conclude that something bigger must be happening behind the scenes. Maybe there's a peace deal coming. Maybe Washington and Moscow are negotiating privately. Maybe we're seeing the first step towards ending this war in Ukraine. But at the moment, there isn't much evidence supporting that interpretation. In fact, the available evidence points in the opposite direction. US-mediated talks remain largely stalled, and Washington has consistently characterized intelligence-level engagement with Moscow as efforts to manage risk rather than negotiations to settle the war. That's a crucial distinction. Communication is not the same thing as negotiation, and a backchannel is not necessarily a peace channel. Sometimes governments establish these channels precisely because they think the risk of escalation is increasing, which brings us to the most important part of the story. Russia may still believe escalation is worthwhile. The underlying assessment is that Moscow may currently have more incentive to escalate than to compromise. Why? There are several pressures building. Russia faces increasing fiscal constraints from a prolonged war. There are indications of weakening public support, and despite enormous expenditure of personnel and equipment, Moscow has not achieved the kind of decisive battlefield breakthrough that would fundamentally change the war. Now, this creates two possible paths. One is that those pressures eventually force Russia towards negotiations. But there's another possibility. Moscow could conclude that it needs to improve its position before entering serious negotiations. And if that's the calculation inside the Kremlin, then we could see another period of escalation first. That could include more severe strikes against Ukraine. It could include additional troop mobilization, and it could potentially include preparations for another major offensive later this year. The logic would be relatively straightforward. Test Ukraine's resilience, increase the military and economic pressure, improve Russia's negotiation position, then we'll talk. If that's Moscow's strategy, meaning diplomacy may not come before the next escalation, it may come after it. So, why is NATO the critical issue? And this is where Ratcliffe's reported warning about NATO becomes important. Ukraine itself is not covered by NATO's Article 5, but the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania are. That means Washington has an enormous interest in preventing the conflict from spilling across the boundary. Even a relatively limited incident could create a dangerous escalation cycle. Imagine a Russian attack hitting NATO territory. Was it deliberate? Was it accidental? Does NATO retaliate? What will Russia do? At what point does an exchange between Russia and a NATO member become a confrontation involving the entire alliance? Those are exactly the kinds of scenarios governments try to prevent through direct communication. And this is why intelligence diplomacy can become more important when ordinary diplomacy is failing. The CIA and Russia's intelligence services can communicate in ways that political leaders sometimes cannot. The discussions can remain private. Both sides can communicate warnings without publicly backing themselves into a corner. And critically, they can establish ways of contacting each other quickly if something goes wrong. So what the visit tells us. What should we actually make from Ratcliffe's trip? I think there are three important signals. First, the US appears sufficiently concerned about escalation to send the CIA director himself to Russia. This doesn't happen casually. The historical precedents suggest these visits tend to occur when the US believes the stakes are unusually high. Second, the US wants Moscow to clearly understand the NATO red line, That suggests the risk Washington is thinking about extends beyond developments purely inside Ukraine. And third, both sides still see value in maintaining communication. Now that is important. Russia and the US remain geopolitical adversaries, but neither benefits from accidentally stumbling into a direct NATO-Russia war. Maintaining a backchannel doesn't mean relations are improving. It means both sides recognize how dangerous the alternative could become. What this does not tell us, and what we should not conclude from this visit, we shouldn't assume Russia is preparing to attack NATO. A US warning about a potential scenario is not evidence that Moscow has made a decision to pursue it. We shouldn't assume a Ukraine settlement is being secretly negotiated. There is currently insufficient evidence for that. And we shouldn't interpret the CIA director's presence in Moscow as a sign of rapprochement. If anything, the historical precedents point towards something more complicated. William Burns went to Moscow in November 2021 precisely because the US believed the security situation there was deteriorating rapidly. 3 months later, Russia invades Ukraine. That doesn't mean Ratcliffe's trip necessarily precedes another major escalation, but it demonstrates why the trip itself shouldn't automatically be interpreted as good news. And then there's the bigger picture. There's also a broader lesson here about how major powers manage confrontation. Public diplomacy gets most of the attention, such as presidential meetings, foreign ministers, official statements, but some of the most consequential communication between adversaries happens away from cameras. During the Cold War, the US and Russia maintained channels precisely because both understood that miscommunication between nuclear powers could be catastrophic. The same logic applies today, and arguably it matters even more when formal diplomacy has broken down. The objective isn't necessarily to solve the conflict. Sometimes it's simply to make sure the conflict doesn't become something much worse. That may be the best way to understand Ratcliffe's Moscow trip. So, what happens next? The next few months will tell us which interpretation is correct. If diplomatic activity begins to accelerate, more high-level meetings, substantial negotiations, and movement on the underlying political issues, then Ratcliffe's visit may eventually look like an early part of a broader diplomatic process. But if Russia intensifies attacks on Ukrainian infrastructure, builds up forces, and prepares another military push, then the visit will look very different in retrospect. It will look like Washington was trying to establish guardrails before another escalation. For now, the second scenario appears more consistent with the available assessment, which leaves us with a very uncomfortable conclusion. The most interesting thing about the CIA director's secret trip to Moscow may not be that Washington and Moscow are talking. It's why Washington apparently believes they need to be talking now. The visit tells us that despite the lack of meaningful progress towards ending the Ukraine war, both sides still understand the importance of maintaining direct communication. It also suggests Washington is thinking seriously about the possibility that the conflict could enter a more dangerous phase. So don't read this trip as evidence that peace is around the corner, at least not yet. It may instead be something much more sobering, an attempt to establish the rules and the red lines before the next round of escalation begins. And that is a development worth watching. If you found this analysis useful, subscribe for more of the geopolitical developments shaping global markets and the world economy. Thank you.